Column 217 is Rosemont Music, which is a service company. Service companies nevertheless may undertake activities that incur overhead costs in the products that they offer for sale. In this case, Rosemont Music has technicians who perform services, and so we use the estimate for the beginning of the year presented here in cells A3 through B5. So similarly to what we've done before, we would come up with our predetermined overhead rate to apply overhead into units of work in process or projects. So on the basis of technician hours, we would have a charge of overhead of $17. So that's how much would be charged throughout the year on an ongoing basis as far as the predetermined overhead rate is concerned. What needs to end up on the books, though, are what actual overhead costs are. So how close was this estimate and proceeding with this estimate to actual overhead costs? So in terms of applying overhead costs, we take our predetermined overhead rate and multiply by actual units of allocation base. So here we need the actual units of the base. So actual technician hours worked during the year were 7,000. So that means the overhead that was applied would be the product of the $17 per technician hour and the 7,000 hours actually worked, or $119,000. So that's how much overhead was charged based on this cost driver, the technician hours, as a cause of overhead. Since we had 3,000 fewer technician hours, the overhead applied was decreased appropriately. Well, when we compare overhead versus actual applied overhead versus actual overhead costs, we would have to, at the end of the year, calculate the actual overhead costs, tally up all of these numbers, and here we see that we have $140,000. So the overhead application process yielded $119,000 of cost for overhead. When we add up all the bills, pay the tab at the end of the year, we have $140,000. So we're short. And and if you've gone out with a group of people, just put it on one bill. At the end of the night, if you're the last one holding it, you're the one who ends up having to come up with the shortage. So in this case, we have less overhead charged into work in process than the actual amount that should have been charged according to what the actual overhead costs were incurred. So since we have this shortfall, we have what's known as underapplied overhead. So I'm going to put a little rule in here. So if this number is less than 0, then we have underapplied, and otherwise we have overapplied. Or if we've had more than that number in there, then we'll have that as overapplied. So here we've underapplied overhead. So just to change the numbers around a little bit, if this were, say, 150, then we'd see that we've over applied. So, it's nice for me, it's nice to set up these different rules so that once we have the amount of overhead applied come in, we put the tab in, and all right, that gives us our decision rule. So we've underapplied. In this case, since we've underapplied, then that means we have charged too little into inventory. So we're short. So now the ultimate resolution of this, so we can slide over here and do this. In part C, the question is assume that they close any under or over applied directly to cost of goods sold. So what we have to think about is, have we put too much or too little into cost of goods sold? And we take care of that here. So the question is that we will have 21,000. It needs to be resolved. So now where does that 21,000 go? So as it turns out, our cost of goods sold number has been too little. We've only had 119,000 going through instead of 140. So we're going to have to debit the cost of goods sold number, and then the credit is the manufacturing overhead control account. So in this case, we have an example where we've followed the rules. We've come up with a predetermined overhead rate, applied it, and as it turns out, the overhead costs aren't behaving quite the same way. And being 21,000 off, that's something that we might want to consider in terms of the actual overhead costs. And this would be a percentage here. We're about 15% short. That's quite a bit off. I would say that if you're within 5%, that might be something that would be acceptable. As it gets closer to 10, that would be you're really time to start looking at options. 15, this overhead costs don't seem to be driven by technician hours.